Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH, and today we are looking at Anzrag the Quake-Mole. So this is one of the new Gruul commanders from Murders at Karlov Manor. So Anzrag is a 4-mana 8/4 legendary mole god, and it says, whenever Anzrag becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase, and you can pay 7 mana, incorporating some red and green pips to say Anzrag must be blocked each combat this turn if able. So importantly, unlike many of the extra combat step abilities that you see all over various red spells, this ability does not give you an additional main phase. It is only an additional combat phase. So you cannot do anything in between those phases at sorcery speed that you would possibly like to do. So Anzrag has a bunch of combos that you can do with it, although they do require multiple steps and usually incorporate 3 to 4 cards, so it's not exactly CEDH tier, but it does feel like something that you could do as a pretty fun casual commander if you'd like. So I've laid it out pretty quickly up here as the steps, and then I'll go into more depth as to how you actually execute that. So step 1, you get Anzrag. Step 2, you make it so that Anzrag has to be blocked. Now you can either do that with Anzrag's own ability, but that is pretty expensive, so there are cheaper ways that we can make it so that Anzrag has to be blocked. But if you've got the mana, sure. Step 3A, you make Anzrag indestructible, attack and kill all blockers. Or step 3B, you use a fog effect, have a pinger out, and attack infinitely and deal infinite damage. So basically, here's the explanation. So if you make it so that Anzrag has to be blocked in combat, you attack, something has to block Anzrag, but then damage gets marked on Anzrag, right? And then you immediately go into the next combat step, Anzrag attacks again, something blocks Anzrag, damage gets marked on Anzrag again. The damage doesn't fade away in between the different combat steps. So if you don't have a way to either make Anzrag indestructible or prevent the damage that's going to be dealt to it, then Anzrag will eventually die. So you therefore, again, you need to either make Anzrag indestructible, or you need to have some way of preventing damage to Anzrag, like give it pro creatures or something, or alternatively, you cast a global fog effect that just prevents combat damage, period, and then you win with a yet another third piece that can win the game by taking all these extra combat steps. Remember, Anzrag untaps each creature you control, so the other creatures that you have either can also attack or can use tap abilities and then be untapped in the next combat step and then tap again. So primarily we're going to use 3 different types of things in order to accomplish this. So the first is that we want our lure effects. We want ways of making it so that Anzrag has to get blocked because we don't want to pay 7 mana for this ability. We want a much cheaper version of this. So we've got a couple of ways to do that. There is Nayeth of the Dire Hunt. So Nayeth is whenever one or more creatures you control fight or become blocked, draw a card. So this is a way to draw cards with the lure effect. And then at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may pay 2 and then hybrid red-green. If you do, double target creature's power until end of turn, and that creature must be blocked this combat if able. So it's a way to have the lure effect, the creature must be blocked effect, for only 3 mana instead of the 7 on Anzrag. Also, we just have the enchantment aura lure. All creatures able to block enchanted creature do so. Compelled duel. Target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn and must be blocked this turn if able. What's going to be one of the best ones because it's so cheap? Irresistible prey. Target creature must be blocked this turn if able, draw a card, and at minimum just cantrips. There's You've Been Caught Stealing. Each creature blocks this turn if able. So this doesn't force any creatures to block Anzrag specifically, but it does force all creatures to block, period. You can also have a secondary mode. You create a treasure token for each opponent who has dealt damage this turn. So sometimes you'll do that, but it's primarily in here for the lure effect. Invasion plans before we move on. Each creature blocks whenever able. Attacking player chooses how each creature blocks. So that's another lure effect. And then finally, what's probably the best effect out of all of them, which is Roar of Challenge. All creatures able to block target creature this turn do so. But also Ferocious, that creature gains indestructible until end of turn if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. So of course Anzrag has 8 power. So this is both an indestructible and lure effect in one card. So then, whether you make Anzrag indestructible or fog is going to change what happens. So if Anzrag is indestructible, it just means that you can attack, lure all of the enemy creatures into blocking it, and then kill all of the opposing creatures. If you have a way that makes only Anzrag have damage prevented to it and not anything else, that will similarly do the same thing. However, if you have a global fog effect, it's going to change the way it goes. So before getting to that, let's just talk about the fogs. So first of all, we've just got the fogs themselves. So we've got Obscuring Haze. This is going to be our best fog because it's a free fog. If you control a commander, you may cast the spell without paying for it. Prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn by creatures your opponents control. Again, this is your opponent's control. So it is a one-sided fog. So Anzrag will survive combat in the same way it would if it was indestructible. Now, apart from that, we've got more global fogs. So we've got, of course, fog. There's also Undergrowth. This is basically just fog. The second part, I guess, is somewhat relevant in that it's if you pay 2 and a red in addition. So if you basically have kicker 2 and a red, this does not affect red creatures. So, of course, Anzrag is a red creature, so it can be a one-sided fog. Of course, if your opponents have red creatures, those creatures will also be similarly unaffected by the fog effect. But if they don't, then you can use this in the same way you would a one-sided fog like Obscuring Haze. And then we've got Blessed Respite. So target player shuffles their graveyard into the library for all combat damage to be dealt this turn. This is basically here just because it's another fog that has a somewhat relevant ability. By shuffling your opponent's graveyard back in, it means you can blank Thassa's Oracle. It means you can also disrupt Underworld Breach. So, like, there's some graveyard stuff that you can interrupt with this, but you wouldn't be playing this if it wasn't a fog, and it's basically a more expensive fog than any of these other ones. So it's main here primarily just because it's both a fog and this effect, which will sometimes come up, but again, you mostly just want it as a fog. Additionally, you've got Maze of Ith. So Maze of Ith is untap target attacking creature, prevent all combat damage will be dealt to and dealt by that creature this turn. So you can attack, maze your Anzrag, and then even though Maze of Ith is tapped, that damage prevention effect will persist through the rest of the entire turn. So you only have to activate Maze once. We also got Spore Frog up here for more fogs. So if the effect is indestructible or one-sided fog, we kill all of our opponent's creatures. But what if it isn't, right? What if it's just a normal fog? Well, we can win via pinging. So we've got pinging. So we've got cards like Chandra's Mage Mutt, Cunning Spark Mage, Goblin Fireslinger, which is the best one because it's only 1 mana, and Thermo Alchemist. All of these, doesn't really matter. The point is they all just tap, deal 1 damage to a player, an opponent. As long as they can deal damage to an opponent, they're all god. So all you need is you need Anzrag, you need a lure effect, either a lure card or 7 mana for its ability. You need a fog effect, and then you need one of these pingers. So you attack, you tap your guy, your opponent is forced to block Anzrag. They block, but nothing happens because fog is active. Anzrag ability triggers, and you get to untap all of your guys and take an extra combat. So you tap your pinger again, you attack with Anzrag again, they have to block it. And this continues infinitely until you deal them infinite damage. Now, the reason this doesn't work with one-sided fogs or indestructible effects is because eventually Anzrag will kill all of your opponent's creatures, so you will only get to ping them for as many times as they have creatures to block with, and if they see that you're going to do this anyway, then they can just decide to block with all of their creatures at once to kill them faster. So it's, again, either you use an indestructible effect or a one-sided fog plus a lure effect to have Anzrag kill all of your opponent's creatures, or you use a global fog effect like Spore Frog, Fog, etc. to prevent all damage from creatures and 2 creatures, and you attack with Anzrag infinitely, and you use a pinger to kill your opponent. Now, aside from all of that, you probably don't want to cast Anzrag and then just have it sit and play for an entire turn cycle, so you do want ways of granting haste, and therefore we're going to have a lot of them because we want to be able to attack with Anzrag immediately. So preferably what we want is we want our lure effect already in play, and then we want to attack with we want to cast Anzrag and then immediately attack with it and go infinite. So haste effect plus lure effect, get Anzrag down, cast our fog or indestructible effect, and then just attack with Anzrag and win the game. So we've got Ashling's Prerogative, Concordant Crossroads, and Mass Hysteria, Hall the Bandit Lord, Lightning Greaves, Generator Servant, Need for Speed, Torch Courier, also Rhythm of the Wild, which additionally makes Anzrag uncounterable, which again is going to be really important. We definitely do not want to pay 4 mana for Anzrag only to have it get countered and then have to pay an additional 6 to cast it again. So these kinds of effects are going to be necessary. So now that we've gone through all of the main components that make Anzrag unique, let's just talk about the rest of the deck. It's going to be your pretty typical red and green cards that you would expect in EDH. So we've got some draw effects in Last March of the Ants, Recycle, Skull Clamp, Sylvan Library, and The Ring. We've got the red blasts to counteract the blue counter spells. We've got some fast mana to get Anzrag down faster, so the Spirit Guides, Jeweled Lotus, Lotus Petal. We've got all of our lands. We have 31 lands, not in counting stuff like Maze of Ith, which doesn't produce mana, but in terms of mana production, here's our lands. Notably, Forbidden Orchard, because it gives our opponent a blocker, so we can't necessarily always count on our opponent having a blocker. It is pretty likely that at least one of our opponents will have a creature that we can attack, but they might not, so Forbidden Orchard gives us one. Then we have our protection effects. These are things that either make our guys uncounterable or make them not susceptible to removal. Because again, our whole strategy revolves around getting Anzrag down, so if it gets countered or killed, that's a big problem. So we've got Allosaurus Shepherd to make it uncounterable, Cavern of Souls to make it uncounterable, City of Solitude, and Dosun the Falling Leaf to make it so that our opponents can't cast spells during our turn, so it's essentially the same thing as uncounterable, but also stops them from casting instant speed removal or whatnot. Deflecting Swat to protect our guys. Delighted Halfling is both ramp and a way to make Anzrag uncounterable. Hajar makes Anzrag indestructible, which protects it from removal that isn't based on exiling. It is also yet another indestructible effect that we can use to combo off. Obviously, Lightning Greaves and Rhythm of the Wild count in that respect. Lightning Greaves with Shroud, Rhythm of the Wild with uncounterable. Sylvan Safekeeper for Shroud. Then we've got Tamio Safekeeping and Tyvar's Stand for indestructible. And of course, Veil of Summer to protect from mostly counter spells, but you know, it also hits like black removal spells. We of course want a bunch of ramp because we want our opponents we want to get Anzrag down super fast, and you know, it's EDH, you just want a bunch of ramp. So it's all the stuff you would usually expect, you know, Mana Dorks, Carpet of Flowers, Ragavan, Mana Rocks, etc. In here in particular, there is Zerta Druid, because Zerta Druid is both a mono ramp creature, but it's also a pinger. So it's mono ramp that can also double as part of our combo. We have a tiny little bit of removal in Beseiju and the Red Blast, and then Worldly Tutor to search for creatures, because our combo cards are often including creatures. So we can use this to, if we need a fog effect, we can search for Spore Frog. If we need an indestructible effect, we can search for Hajar. If we need our pinger, we can of course search for any of our pingers. We can also search for Neath if we need a lure. So the Worldly Tutor can find us whatever piece it is that we're missing. And that is basically it for Anzrag. So obviously you can tinker around with the deck. Maybe you consider this too high power, although I wouldn't. I don't think this is competitive in like CDH circles, for example. But maybe this is too high power for you. You can tone down the power. Obviously you don't need to be playing like all of the best lands like Taiga and whatnot. So if you're on a budget, you can obviously change a bunch of these lands around. Maybe you want a more interactive deck and not to lean so far into comboing. So you could perhaps, you know, you don't need all 4 of these pingers, only, you know, just having one alone would suffice. Maybe you don't need multiple redundant lure effects. So you can strip down and cut however many of these additional copies of combo pieces maybe, and add in more like removal spells or sweepers or whatnot as needed. But this is basically the shell of how I would build an Anzrag deck. And so yeah, that is going to do it for Anzrag the Quake-Mole in EDH.